The next type of nonverbal communication that we're going to discuss is proxemics. And I'm going to be honest with you right up front here. Proxemics was one of my favorite parts of learning about nonverbal communication because I just found it to be so interesting and so true. So proxemics is the study of how space and distance influence communication. And the cultural anthropologist Edward T. Hall came up with this idea of the proxemic distances, which are the varying definitions of what our personal space is based on contextual, situational, and relational circumstances. And so he defined these 4 zones or these 4 spaces that we have our interpersonal interactions in. The first of these spaces is the public space. This happens beyond 12 feet from your body. So where you are standing, it is happening 12 feet away at least. And this public space is a really formal and therefore not very intimate space. Typically, we use the public space when we are engaged in some kind of formal speech, for example, and we are very removed from the audience or removed from the interaction. And in a normal interaction, if someone passes through our public space, we are not obligated or expected to acknowledge that person or interact with that person because they are too far away. When they are more than 12 feet away, it's expected that we didn't necessarily see them, and so we don't have to acknowledge the fact that we did see them. If someone is in our social space, however, this means that they are anywhere from 4 feet away from us to 12 feet away from us. So still a fair distance. And this typically happens in the context of professional and casual interaction. And it's definitely not that public space where someone is just too far away to interact with you, but it's also not terribly intimate. So we can have conversations in this space. We're just having it with people that we don't necessarily know very well. And so we are literally keeping people at arm's length in this social space. So if you were to hold out one arm and the other person that you are interacting with also held out one arm and you kind of touched the tips of your fingers together, that would be approximately 4 to 6 feet away. So you're keeping them at arm's length and keeping them out of your personal space because you just don't know them that well. If someone is in our personal space, that means that they are anywhere from 1.5 feet away to us to 4 feet away from us. This personal space is reserved for our friends, our close acquaintances, and our significant others. And this is what you've probably heard referred to or that you've referred to yourself as your personal bubble. And if someone that you don't know enters your personal bubble, you might get slightly offended or slightly miffed because you don't know them. They are not allowed to enter that personal space. And there's also zones within this personal bubble. So the outer zone is anywhere from 2.5 feet to approximately 4 feet. And this outer zone of the personal space is really useful for private conversations between people who are not interpersonally close with one another. Whereas the inner zone of the personal space, which is 1.5 feet to 2.5 feet, is reserved for people that we are interpersonally close to or whom we are trying to get to know. The final space that we have here is the intimate space. This is anywhere from your body to 1.5 feet in front of you. And this is a very, very close space, as you can tell. And therefore, it is reserved for only our closest friends, our family members, and our romantic and intimate partners. Being close to someone and feeling their physical presence can be really comforting. And that's why we only allow certain people into this intimate space. Additionally, we have certain social norms regarding the amount of this type of closeness that can be displayed in public. So PDA, right? Public displays of affection are a good example, and we have these social norms surrounding those. The really interesting thing about these proxemics and about these different spaces is that individuals really vary in terms of their reactions to people entering certain zones. And what constitutes a violation of that space is very subjective and contextual. For example, if you are standing in line at the grocery store and someone is standing too close behind you, you can kind of feel them breathing on you. You might take a step forward to try to increase the space between you because that person has violated your space. Alternatively, you might turn around and give them a dirty look because they have violated your space. So that reaction really varies. And this reminds me of this time when I was traveling and we were just all getting ready to get off of the plane. And it was finally our turn, so I stood up and I was getting my bag out of the overhead compartment. And as a result of being in this really tight space, if you've ever been on an airplane, you know how close those spaces are. I accidentally bumped into a woman behind me when I was pulling my bag down and stepped on her foot. And I apologized profusely for doing this because I knew that I had invaded her personal space, right? I had injured her a little bit. And she was livid that I had invaded her personal space, when in reality she was probably a little bit too close to me to begin with. But I could hear her complaining about me all the way down the airplane, all the way down the terminal as we exited the airport. And I was just perplexed that this woman was so offended by the fact that I bumped into her in this really close space. And, I had apologized for bumping into her and for stepping on her foot accidentally, but she was still so angry at me. And that just goes to show that people react differently when you invade those personal spaces and when you violate those personal spaces. Another part of proxemics is this idea of territoriality. Territoriality is this innate drive that we have to take up and defend spaces. So maybe you have a preferred place that you sit at a restaurant, or you have a usual desk that you sit at in a classroom. And so we claim these certain spaces as our own. And there's a range of these different spaces that we claim and a range of our reactions to those spaces being invaded. So we have primary spaces, secondary spaces, and public spaces. Primary spaces are spaces that are officially ours. So these are things like our house, our yard, our room, our personal desk, the side of the bed that we sleep on, and we get rightfully angry or rightfully annoyed when someone invades that primary space because this is officially ours, right? I have the key to this house. No one is allowed in who isn't allowed by me, or this is my desk, this is my room, those sorts of things. Secondary spaces are interesting because these are spaces that don't belong to us and they are not exclusively under our control, but they can be associated with us, which can lead us to assume that that space will be open to us and available for us whenever we need it. And a really good example of this is the classroom desk. So when you go into a class on the first day of school and you pick a desk, generally speaking, in my experience, students who stick around tend to stick in the same desks more or less. And if you've been going to a class for 4 or 5 weeks and you've been sitting in the same desk every day for those 4 to 5 weeks, if you come in on week 6 and one of your classmates is sitting in your desk, you might get a little bit annoyed at them or get a little bit angry at them because that is your desk, that is your spot. And it's not your spot, right? It doesn't belong to you. It's not exclusively under your control. There are dozens of students who probably use that desk on a weekly basis, but you have come to expect that when you enter that classroom at that time for that class, that desk will be available to you. And so the secondary territories are really interesting because we do get very defensive of those territories. And then finally, we have public spaces. These are spaces that are open to all people, but that we can claim for short periods of time. And so people mark their territories by putting a jacket on it, or putting a bag down in the seat, or spreading papers out on the desk, or placing a coffee on the desk. And that is when we are claiming that space as ours for this limited period of time. But those spaces are often up for grabs, which is why we use those markers. So if you are in the library, for example, studying, and you've got this table, if you need to go to the restroom while you're in the library and you don't want somebody to take that space, you might leave your book out on the table, or leave your jacket or something along those lines to communicate to the people around you that, yes, this is a public space, but I have claimed it for the time being, so please do not take this space. And we have all of these really interesting rules when it comes to public spaces. For example, if you're in the library and you are sitting at a desk or sitting at a table that can hold up to 4 people, let's say, if somebody else enters the library and looks around, and if there is an empty table, they are expected to sit at that empty table. If a new person comes into the library and there's an empty table, but they come and sit at the table that you are sitting at, you might be thinking to yourself, what is this person doing? Why are they sitting at this table when there's a perfectly good empty table right over there? Whereas if that same person enters that same library space, but there are no tables open, right? Every table is occupied by at least one person. It is more socially acceptable for that person to join you at your table because they have nowhere else to go. Similarly, with public spaces like the bus or the movie theater, it's generally expected that if there is that we keep at least one space in between us unless completely necessary. So if you are in the movie theater, for example, and you are sitting in your favorite spot, I like to sit in the front row in front of the bar, for example. If you are sitting there and someone else comes into this mostly empty movie theater and they come and sit smack next to you and you don't know this person, you're probably going to look around and go, what the hell? Right? There's hundreds of empty seats in this theater and you chose to sit in the seat right next to me. Right? We might get offended or annoyed that that person took up that seat. Similarly, if we're on a bus, right? When I was taking public transportation on a regular basis, I had a specific place on the bus that I liked to sit. But when I entered the bus and if that seat was taken, no big deal, right? Because it's a public space. I don't own that space. It's not associated with me. And so I would just have to sit somewhere else on the bus. And similarly, if you are on the bus and it's starting to fill up, generally speaking, people will fill empty rows first and not fill the one space that is beside you, unless that is the only space that is left to fill, right? So people will fill empty spaces first before they start filling partially full rows. So I just find it super interesting, the ways that we communicate using space and the ways that we use space just in general as well. When someone invades our territory, we are likely to either just kind of like give off really negative vibes so that hopefully they will go away, or we might give them the side eye, or we might actually say something to them. That last reaction is a little bit more rare than the others. Most of the time, we'll just kind of silently look at them and judge them for invading our space. But this whole idea of proxemics and territoriality is just so interesting to me when it comes to nonverbal communication, and the ways that we use space can really send very clear messages to the people around us. So think about that the next time that you are in a public space.